Hi, and good morning, everybody. It's a great pleasure to see you for this second Q&A session. I am joining you from Paris today. Before I start with a few words of introduction, and before I start responding to the questions, could somebody very quickly type in the questions box something just to make sure that you can hear me all right, please? Okay. Let me start by answering some of the questions that you did ask on this forum, and let me maybe start with the first of these questions, that is basically on the G20 and the declaration that was made by the Australian Prime Minister, Mr. Abbott, about the future of coal and the fact that coal is good for humanity because it is good for prosperity, and therefore that it is an essential part of our economic future. First, let me tell you a little bit about the story of the G20, because I think it's an interesting story, and it reveals the political dynamics that are at play currently, and it's interesting because the Australian Prime Minister, Mr. Abbott, did fight very hard to exclude climate change from the G20 agenda. So it was supposed to be not even addressed in the final declaration of the G20. So the plan was to have not even a word about climate change mitigation or adaptation in the final G20 declaration. And what happened is very interesting, because basically all of the other countries decided that it was very important, in particular with the view to send a message to the COP21 in Paris next year, that it was very important to include something on climate change in the G20 declaration. So you had very interesting dynamics at play, where the host, the organizer of the G20, Mr. Abbott, didn't want to have a single word on climate change, but all of the other countries, without an exception, said that it was important to include something, and to include something positive, and to send a positive message to Paris next year. What is, I think, especially important in this fact is that for almost the very first time, the large emerging countries, so China, India, Brazil, were also of the view that the G20 should deal with climate change, which was not the case previously. At least most of the time it was not the case, and the large emerging countries had very often expressed the view that the G20 was not a political forum to deal with climate change, that it should be addressed primarily and almost exclusively under the UNFCCC, the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change. So they had resisted previous attempts by G20 presidency to include climate change in the agenda, but this time it was the opposite dynamic that was at play, and the host against the inclusion of climate change in the agenda, and all of the others saying that they were in favor of it, and it resulted in a pretty good paragraph, by the way, included in the G20 final declaration. Since the question was about coal, more specifically, what is also extremely interesting is that although the Australian Prime Minister made this very positive statement about coal, two things happened. First, the Chinese, who are for the time being big importers of Australian coal, reaffirmed what we discussed last week. That is their commitment to have their greenhouse gases emissions peak no later than 2030. And they went beyond that to explain that the principal mean to achieve this emission reduction goal would be to introduce a cap, an absolute cap on the consumption of coal in China, and that as a result from that, their consumption, but also their imports from Australia would decrease. So less exports opportunity for Australia as a result of the energy and climate policy in China, which is, of course, a very interesting dynamic. Not exactly the same dynamic, but also very interesting. The Indian minister also said at the G20 that the objective for India was to stop imports from coal from Australia in the next 3 years, which is a very short time frame, and that would have, of course, very significant consequences, economic consequences for the coal industry in Australia. And in the case of India, as I said, it's not the same dynamic than in China, because India is still far from projecting a cap, a maximum amount in the coal consumption. This is almost the opposite, and this is, well, a good trend for energy security in India, but a very worrying trend from a greenhouse gases emissions perspective. I mean, there is kind of a rush for coal that is currently going on in India, and lots of policy discussions to encourage investments in coal. So a worrying trend, even though that comes with an effort to support renewable energy. But what I felt was very interesting in the declaration from the Indian minister at the G20 is that the intention, at least, was to stop imports from Australia in the very near future. So you see that the statement from the Australian Prime Minister, Mr. Abbott, is already called into question, because I mean, if the Australian coal industry wants to succeed and earn revenues, it needs to export, and at least two of its biggest export destinations, consumers, have sent signal very recently that they might not be so interested in importing Australian coal anymore, and that is, as I said, China and India, although for different reasons. But the most important part to understand is that, as we have explained in the course itself, there is only room for coal in a 2-degree global carbon budget if coal comes with carbon capture and sequestration. And this is something that needs to happen pretty quickly. The fact that, in particular, the coal-fired power plants need to be with carbon capture and sequestration if we want to have a level of cumulative greenhouse gases emissions that fits within the 2-degree global carbon budget. This is especially the case if you look at the dynamics of investment in the coal industry. And of course, the investments are very high today. So that's why there is, in principle, such an incentive for coal producing, coal exporting countries and industries, also mining industries or utilities using a lot of coal to produce electricity, to invest into the research, the development, the demonstration, and eventually the deployment of carbon capture and sequestration. This is, and we have already discussed that at length in the previous discussion session, and unfortunately the investment dynamics in the research, development and demonstration of carbon capture and sequestration are not enough to give a chance to deploy CCS at the scale and at the time that is needed to stay within the 2-degree global carbon budget. So there needs to be, and this is, I think, one of the objectives for COP21 in Paris, there should be a scaled up effort to ramp up the research and development of CCS. And of course, countries like Canada or Australia or China should have a very big incentive to do it. So this is not yet where the discussion in Australia is, and you're very aware, I'm sure, of the formidable political adversity on climate change policy in Australia, because the Prime Minister is really not only a climate skeptic, but really climate denier. But there should be a reason for Australia, given its dependency on coal to produce electricity, but also more broadly its dependency on coal to generate export revenues. There should be a very strong incentive to invest in carbon capture and sequestration, which is something that I hope we could convince the Australian government and some of the Australian companies to do in the near future. So to sum up the response to this first question, as I said, interesting political dynamics at the G20, because the Australian Prime Minister, Mr. Abbott, even though he was the host and the organizer of the G20, ended up being very isolated on the issue of climate change, because it didn't want to include it, and all of the others wanted to, included some of the countries who in the past resisted the efforts to include climate change into the G20 agenda, and that is essentially the large emerging countries, this time came in support of climate change mitigation and adaptation in the G20. And the other part of my response is that there can be a future for coal into a deep decarbonization pathway, but it has to be, and it has to be very quickly, coal plus carbon capture and sequestration. And as I think we say in the course, it doesn't mean the fact that we have the option of adding carbon capture and sequestration to coal to limit the emissions. It doesn't mean that it can be business as usual for the coal industry. And it is essentially for two reasons. I mean, the first is that, well, there is still an uncertainty, there is still a debate among researchers regarding the precise potential for storage of carbon underground, but it is going to be limited. So it's not as if we could burn all the coal we have and easily put it under the ground, because we're going to have a limited amount of storage options. Sometimes they won't be near the production of electricity by using coal, so it also requires the building of pipelines or the use of trucks if it's not too far to transport CO2, which adds to the cost. And this is the second main reason why even with CCS, it's not business as usual for the coal industry. It's because CCS is going to have a cost. It's going to have a cost that is significant. I mean, there are hopes through the ongoing development and demonstration projects that the cost of CCS will decrease, and the prospect is indeed pretty good, but it is going to remain expensive, and therefore the cost of producing electricity through other means, and in particular through renewable energies such as wind and solar and hydro, is going to be less than the cost of producing electricity through coal plus CCS. So yes, there is a future for coal. It's not business as usual in any means. It's in any case a very, very significant departure from the current trends of investment in coal, and it has to be absolutely coal plus CCS if there is to be a future for coal. So that was the response to the first question. Then I think, let me try to find it. There was a question I can't find any more about is the research and development we're talking about to make sure that we develop some new technologies that are not available today, or that are still at a cost that is too high to be deployed in the economy. Should this research be public, or should it be private? So let me try to respond to this question by making the case for what I think should and I hope will be a very important part of the agreement to be reached in Paris next year, and that is the idea of having public-private partnerships to accelerate the research and the development and the demonstration of some of the key technologies that, again, exist today at the pilot scale. So it's not as if we had no clue what these technologies are. but we need to make them more reliable technically, and we also need to make them less expensive economically to get them to compete when there is a level playing field. So when there is a carbon price that is introduced in the economy, to make them competitive with some of their alternative technologies. So just to be clear, we're talking here about technologies such as, well, first, a new generation of renewable energies. We already have pretty efficient renewable energies today, but there are developments underway to try to still improve the performance, the yield of the solar PV, so solar photovoltaic panels, and therefore make them perform even better and produce electricity that is even cheaper by using a different technology to the one that is used today. Also, efforts to produce windmills that can be used offshore, but that can be used deeply offshore, therefore increasing the size of the wind potential that can be tapped through the use of these windmills. Efforts also to develop power grids that are smarter and enable the penetration of high levels of renewable energy on the grid, given that some of these renewable energies, in particular wind and solar, they're inherently time sensitive, they're intermittent. So the power grids need to accommodate this intermittency. Also, efforts, as I said, to deploy carbon capture and sequestration. If you look at the transport sector, and there was a question on the transport sector, so I'll come back specifically to that in a moment, but you've got a broad portfolio of options to reduce greenhouse gases emissions, and that includes, in the short term, that's not sufficient in the long term, but in the short term, that includes hybrid or plug-in hybrid vehicles, but also along the way, along the trajectory, electric vehicles or hydrogen fuel cell vehicles, or the use of vehicles that rely on sustainable low carbon biofuels. So that is essentially biofuels of second or third generation. So there is, as I said, a very broad portfolio of technologies that we know about today. We have tested at the pilot scale. The results are pretty promising, but we need to invest more in their research, in their development, and in their demonstration before we're able to deploy them at scale in the economy. And there is a very strong case to be made for some kind of public-private investment. So that's the response to the question. It's neither only the public that has to invest in these technologies or only the private, but there is a very strong case to be made for a co-investment of public and private sources. And there are different reasons for that, even though, of course, if you look at the innovation chain, and if you start from the very basic research, then go to applied research, then go to pilot scale demonstration projects, and then to commercial demonstration projects, of course, the higher, the more upstream you are in the innovation chain, the stronger is the case for at least a large share of public investment as opposed to private investment. And when you go through the later stages of innovation, for example, when you reach the point of commercial size demonstration projects, of course, the private sector should be an important part, an important source of the investment in these commercial size investment projects. This is, by the way, exactly what is happening. I mean, if you look at, for example, at some of the carbon capture and sequestration demonstration projects that are being implemented in the European Union, you can take the example of the White Rose project that is being implemented in the UK. You have, well, essentially a mix of different sources of fundings and also a mix of different types of financing instruments to support and encourage and incentivize this demonstration project. And that is first money coming from the European Commission. So there is a fund that is called the NER 300, and that is essentially a fund with money that comes from the auctioning of the emissions permits in the European Union emission trading scheme. So a fraction of the cost of these permits is put into this fund that is called the NER 300 that includes approximately 2 billion euros, and this fund is used to invest into low carbon energy projects in Europe. So part of this money is used to pay for the CCS demonstration project called White Rose in the UK. There is also money and guarantee that is put on the table by the British government itself. So the British government is paying some kind of a feed-in tariff. So it's called a contract for difference. So it's paying the difference in between the average cost of producing electricity and the cost at which the electricity will be produced in this power plant with CCS. And then, of course, the industry itself is providing upfront investments to the project, and that is the different industrial participants to the project. So the utility, of course, but also the technology providers, in particular, Alstom is one of them, and injects some money in the project. So you see with the example of CCS, both the rational, the argument for mixed sources of public and private finance, but also in practice, what are the different types of financing instruments that can be used to do this blending of the different sources. We could take another example, which is the example of electric vehicles, because it includes a component that is interesting, that is important, and that we see in many of the other low carbon technologies, and that is the fact that there needs to be a network infrastructure that is built to support the deployment of a low carbon technology. So in this case, you need a pretty dense, by the way, if you want it to be functioning well, you need a pretty dense network of charging stations if you want to be able to deploy electric vehicles. And there is, in this case, also a strong incentive for the private sector. And here it is essentially two different types of businesses. It is the car manufacturers, but it's also the electric utilities, because of course the shift from internal combustion engines towards electric vehicles means that we would use more electricity. So there is an incentive for these two types of businesses to invest into the network infrastructure of charging stations, but the incentive is not big enough. So that's why you see in many countries or in many cities that the government or the local authority, in most of cases, the cities is paying for at least part of the cost of building the network infrastructure. So that's just another example where you see the rationale for public-private investment into low carbon technologies. Let me go to another question. Yeah. Let me discuss very briefly the issue of the transport sector more specifically. So I just came back from a panel at the annual meeting of the WBCSD, that is the World Business Council for Sustainable Development, and we had a very interesting panel session on low carbon transportation options, and we discussed with well, all the big players in the car industry in the US, in Europe, and in Asia. So we had representatives from Ford, from Renault, from BMW, from Toyota, and we had also companies such as UPS, the service company, and that is very interesting because they rely on very different transportation modes to deliver the products to their services. So they're a very interesting company to think about the different options that are available to do low carbon transport and how they can be combined to result in the lowest possible level of greenhouse gases emissions. And what I took from this discussion, which was interesting and encouraging in a way, is that all of the car manufacturers today, so all the big ones, all the major players, as I said, in the three big regions for the car industry, so the US, Europe, and Asia, all of them have plans to reach zero emissions by the second half of the century. So very consistent with the objective of deep decarbonization and the 2-degree global carbon budget. And this is the way they look at their long-term business strategy. I mean, they have understood the need to shift the transportation modes or change the technologies and find ways of making sure that people can be people and products can be transported from point A to point B, but without greenhouse gases emissions. It's interesting because they have a portfolio of different technologies in their business strategies, and they combine They intend to combine these different technologies in different ways, but there is also a little bit of a sequence in time, and that progresses towards the need to progressively decarbonize really deeply the transport sector. So as I said, what you see in the short term in particular is a growing reliance on hybrid vehicles because they emit less greenhouse gases than the current generation of internal combustion engines. But in the meantime, it's a solution that is, of course, insufficient to reach zero emissions by 2050, because it's a solution that is low carbon, but it's not a solution that is zero carbon, and this is what we need eventually. So they have these plans, and it includes in particular electric vehicles, but also for some companies, and that is in particular Toyota is investing pretty heavily on hydrogen fuel cells vehicles, and in fact it's going to launch a hydrogen fuel cell vehicle next year in 2015. It's called the Sedan, and it's going to be launched first in Japan, but then very quickly in Germany and in California, which are the three countries or states that are interested and almost ready to deploy hydrogen fuel cell vehicles. Then I think it's important to understand that the biofuel, the sustainable biofuel option. So as I said, it can't really be, at least not at the global scale. It can't be the first generation of biofuels, so those produced through maize or corn, because it competes with the use of land and the use of crops for food purposes, and that's why, I mean, it might be a solution for some very large countries where there isn't such of a competition like Brazil. But it's not a solution for the world, because you need to make sure that you find ways of producing energy that do not conflict with the objective of food security, but also with the objective of protecting biodiversity. I saw several questions related to biodiversity protection here, so that's why it is so important to invest into some new generation of biofuels to make sure that they don't have a negative impact on biodiversity, and that means in particular using second generation biofuels, so those using the waste, or third generation biofuels, so those using algae. And my point is that although it's pretty clear that electric vehicles and fuel cell hydrogen vehicles can be a solution for the light duty vehicles, so for the transport of passengers, it is much less clear that we're going to be able to do, at least quickly enough, improvements in the batteries that are sufficient to enable the long distance shipment of products through trucks by relying on electricity, or so that's why when people discuss about biofuels, they see mainly the biofuels used by trucks, or, by the way, used as fuel jet for planes. So there is a very broad portfolio of technologies. All of them can be combined and sequenced in time, and the portfolio of specific technologies is going to depend on the country and the company. But you're right. I mean, there needs to be an effort to harmonize the standards of these different technologies, because you need to make sure as a company, if you invest in a given technology, that the size of the market is large enough for you to make sales that pay back for your upfront investment in research and development. So there is, for example, an effort to try to harmonize the standards of electric cars, in particular in Europe, to make sure that the standards in France and Germany and the rest of the Europe are the same, and as I said, can make it possible for the private sector to tap into a market that is large enough to benefit from economies of scale. So it's an interesting dynamic. There is no contradiction, but it's an interesting tension in between. Well, on the one hand, there is a wide portfolio of technologies that is going to be deployed, and we're going to be able to rely on several and not only on one. And in the meantime, there needs to be an effort to find harmonized standard for the different technologies. Let me try to respond to another question. There was a question that I can't find anymore, but that was essentially a question that said, well, if the existing and proven reserves in fossil fuel exceed the size of the global carbon budget for 2 degrees Celsius, how come the fossil fuel industry is still investing in the exploration of new resources? And that is, of course, a very good question, because this is exactly what we are seeing, right? I mean, we shouldn't completely fool ourselves. So it's good that there is investment in renewable energy, but in the meantime, nature doesn't really care about all the nice things we do, but it cares about the bad things we do, and this is essentially the reliance on uncapped and free emitting fossil fuels, and the investment dynamics in the fossil fuel industry today are extremely worrying, and certainly not in line with the budget for the 2-degree limit. And this is the case, by the way, for the 3 fossil fuels. It is certainly the case for coal, but also the case for oil, and also for gas, which can be a bridging option towards a truly decarbonized energy policy by using gas as a bridge towards the use of more renewable energy, but it can't be a deep decarbonization strategy to simply shift from coal to gas. So as I said, there is a trend of investment in the fossil fuel industry that is completely out of line with what is necessary from a climate change mitigation and adaptation perspective. And it is for, of course, lots of different reasons, but also because there is a difference in the time frame, right? So we're talking in one case about, well, there is a difference in time frame, but also a difference in incentives, right? So in one case, when we talk about climate change mitigation, we are talking about the delivery of a long-term public good. And in the other case, when we're talking about the fossil fuel industry, we're talking about very short-term and very private benefits. So, of course, the contradiction in between the two explains that the current investment in the fossil fuel industry are not in line with the objective for 2 degrees Celsius, and it's because in the current system there is a very big premium for short-term profits in industries, and this is what they see, and therefore they maximize short-term gains and are not looking to the longer term and what needs to be done in a deep decarbonization strategy. There are, of course, things that are being done by some of the fossil fuel industries, certainly not all of them, and certainly not a large number of them, in particular in the US. I mean, there is more interesting things happening in particular in the oil and gas industry in Europe than elsewhere. So some of them invest in CCS and pretty heavily. This is the case in particular for Shell. Some of the other companies, they seem to have less faith in the fact that CCS could become an option, so they are investing more heavily in renewable energy, and that is the case in particular for Total. But there is absolutely no doubt that these investments are way insufficient for a deep decarbonization strategy. Much more needs to be done. But for that, we also need, and this is an interesting development that's been happening in the recent years, we also need the financial market to reflect better the potential impacts coming from climate change, but also the fact that there will be a price on carbon in the economy, and a price on carbon that is going to increase. And if you include a price on carbon, then you change the way the assets of the fossil fuel companies are being valued. And this is a discussion that has started in particular with the credit rating agencies, as I think I mentioned during the previous discussion. And there is a think tank / NGO that does a very interesting job in this respect, and that is called Carbon Tracker. And they are trying to show that by introducing a carbon price that is in no way unrealistic, but very much likely now, you, as I said, change the value of the assets of these fossil fuel companies, and you need that to provide an incentive for the reorientation of investments. So it is a fight that is very far from being over, because, as I said, I mean, the investments of the fossil fuel industry these days are clearly not going in the right direction. There are some small things happening here and there that are interested, but they need to be massively scaled up, and we need the financial market to reflect the true price of carbon and the true cost of carbon emissions, if we want to provide the framework and the regulations and the incentives that are necessary to reorient these investments. Let me try maybe to respond to one last question. So yes, let me maybe finish by providing some more comments to the announcement that was made by China. So there are two things. So you remember that as part of the declaration with the US, China committed to peak its greenhouse gases emissions no later than 2030, which I said last week is both extremely significant in the sense that this is the first time that China positioned itself as no longer only in the position of reducing the growth of its emissions and trying to decouple its growth in GDP from its growth in greenhouse gases emissions. So it's the first time that China is saying, I mean, we see coming the peak, the absolute peak in our emissions, and the point after which we will have to start to make our emissions decline. So this is a very significant shift for China. In the meantime, the date of the peak that was announced in the declaration with the US is a pretty serious problem, in the sense that there is almost no chance to stay within the 2-degree limit if China peaks its emissions as late as 2030, because it would result in cumulative emissions globally that are way too high to have a likely or even a reasonable chance to stay within the 2-degree limit. Just as an order of magnitude, there are, of course, different possible scenarios to reduce greenhouse gases emissions to stay within the 2-degree limit, but most of them, almost all of them, have the global emissions that peak by 2020. And it doesn't mean that China would have to peak by 2020. It's the date for the global peak, but China is such a big share of the global emissions that if you have China peaking in 2030, it's very difficult to see how the world can peak by 2020, even if you assume much more aggressive efforts to reduce emissions than what is currently the case for the other countries. So it's probably more around 2025 that you would need the emissions to peak in China if you want to be in line with a global 2-degree emission reduction target. That being said, the way the target was framed by the Chinese government leaves room for improvement, in the sense that it says by around 2030 with the intention to peak earlier. So it means that yes, the emissions in China could peak earlier, but no later than 2030. That being said, once you've introduced the ID of 2030, it more or less becomes the target. It was interesting, by the way, to witness that I think the Chinese felt a little bit pressed by the Americans to come up very quickly with a joint statement, whereas they had not yet completely finished their analysis of what was an ambitious but realistic emission reduction pathway for China. The official effort that was launched was due to complete by January. So they were not completely ready when the announcement was made last week. There is a very interesting debate in China, a macroeconomic debate that explains how the climate change mitigation target was framed, and you've got basically two camps in China. To summarize and simplify, you've got people who think that even to 2030, the GDP growth rate in China is going to be close to 7 to 8%, and that China is going to continue with its current GDP growth model, where industry, and in particular heavy industry, and public investment in infrastructures is a big share, a big driver of the GDP growth. And you have another camp of economists and politicians in China who think that the GDP growth on average is probably going to be closer to 5 to 6%, not 7 to 8, and it is going to be a challenge anyway for China to land softly and not to crash after a period of extremely rapid growth, incentivized in particular by public investment. And this group of people who hopes that China will land softly at 5 or 6% of average GDP growth rate also says that China is going to have to rely on a new growth engine, less dependent on heavy industry and public investment in infrastructure. And this debate is far from being settled in China. And in a way, because it was not settled, the Chinese, I think, made a conservative assumption and said, well, if GDP growth is 7 to 8% and industry continues to be a very high share of our GDP, then it's impossible to peak before 2030. Whereas if you see, in particular, the macroeconomic policy for China differently, you could certainly hope for a peak that comes much earlier. So you see, it's not only a discussion about technologies. It's also very much a macroeconomic discussion in China. Then, since the Chinese government, now that it has made this announcement about the peak in 2030, is not going to change its mind for during next year, what remains to be seen and to be discussed is the level for the cap in emissions, because it's one thing to say we're going to peak by a certain date, But what is also extremely important is to discuss what is going to be the level of the peak, because this is what has an impact on global warming and climate change. And this is where this discussion on the cap on coal use by 2020 comes from. So you're right. There is absolutely a discussion that is going on in China about introducing a cap on coal use by 2020. There are different numbers that are being mentioned in the debate, so I won't comment a particular number because I don't have any particular insights into the issue, but it is very true that now that China has announced its objective for reducing greenhouse gases emissions and having them peak in 2030, this is the next extremely important debate in China related to climate change mitigation, because the cap on coal use is the single most important measure that will determine the level at which China will peak its emissions. So a very important debate to follow. I think I will stop here. Again, thank you very much for participating to this Q&A session, and I'm sorry again I didn't have the time to respond to the very many interesting questions, but do not hesitate to send me an email with some of these questions, and I'll do my best to try and give you a few words to respond to these questions. I very much look forward to discuss with you next time. I think this is a session we will do from Lima in Peru, because I will be attending the COP20 of the UNFCCC. So I think this is the next time we will discuss together. Once again, thank you very much, and looking forward to talk to you next time. Bye.